समझ नहीं आ रहा अपने सैलरी इंक्रीमेंट का क्या करूं।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स के एसआईपी का टॉप अप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
क्या? समझ में नहीं आया।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स का एसआईपी टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
अब समझा।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme related documents carefully.
Let's talk about Trump, Putin, and Alaska, and India's quest in an oddly connected triangle. You know, Donald Trump is at it again. The man who claimed he could end wars in 24 hours is about to again try his hand at the bloodiest conflict in Europe since the Second World War, which is the Ukraine war. And curiously, India is watching this with cautious optimism. Prime Minister Modi has even spoken to President Zelensky on phone. So let's unravel. At first glance, these two threads, Trump meeting with Vladimir Putin in Alaska and India's hopes, feel out of sync. Though not if you follow the breadcrumb trail of strategic ego, political grudges, economic carrots, and converging interests. So the scene is that on Friday, 15th August, Trump will meet Putin at Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson in Anchorage, Alaska. Now, you know, this is no random coffee shop. During the Cold War, it was the top cover for North America, guarding against Soviet bombers. Today, it still houses the F-22 Raptors, the stealthiest fighters in the world that routinely intercept Russian jets sniffing around US airspace. Now, a day before the Alaska meeting, European leaders are scrambling to have a phone call with Trump, cautioning him of all the things that could go wrong for Europe. Now, the amount of international speculation this news has garnered is understandable. You know, this is Trump and Putin's first in-person encounter since Osaka in 2019 and Trump's first as the newly re-elected president in 2024. Now, this announcement has also been dropped in classic Trump style, which is just before the August 8 deadline for fresh sanctions on Russia failing to stop the war. So instead of pulling the sanction trigger, Trump decided to invite Putin for a chat in the Arctic. And then there is something here that gives India some deja vu. Now, if you're in New Delhi, you have seen this movie before, and it wasn't exactly a box office hit. You know, smug with Trump's cozying up to Putin in the early weeks of taking office, India was ill-prepared for Trump's repivot to Europe. Trump's latest swings on Russia policy has had collateral damage in the form of India. I'm sure you know that punitive tariffs were slapped on Indian goods, a hard negotiated trade deal stands iced, and a 25-year strategic partnership has been suddenly made to look rather inconsequential. Now, the not-so-secret spoiler here is also Modi government's misreading of Donald Trump on events after Operation Sindoor. The cold shoulder towards Prime Minister Modi and punitive tariffs hasn't solely been about India buying Russian oil. It has been more about Modi refusing to publicly acknowledge Trump for facilitating the ceasefire between India and Pakistan, something that Trump has bragged about dozens of times already, while India has repeatedly and, I would say, unnecessarily denied. Now, this sudden reduction of a self-assured India to a strategic expendable has gone down bitterly in New Delhi. This time, though, Delhi is keeping its powder dry. Any US-Russia dialogue is welcome and conducive to Indian interest. But the memory, impact, and shock of recent disappointments still lingers. That said, my opinion is pragmatism calls for keeping our cards open. The calculation is simple. If Trump warms up to Putin, India might get short-term relief like those pesky tariffs lifted and long-term diplomatic flexibility, which means engaging both Russia and the West without alienating either. But there is a catch. India has talked the big game about playing peacemaker and mediator, but hasn't shown much appetite or capacity for actual, even limited mediation since Trump took office. No prisoner swaps, no ceasefire preparatory talks, nothing on the level of what the Emiratis, or Saudis, or Turks have done. So the truth is, India's leverage in ending the war is rather limited. More disappointingly, India has not even lived up to its widely respected humanitarian active reputation either. Now, part of the problem is that India hasn't capitalized on its 2023 moment when we hosted the G20 and basked in the unending global attention. Instead of pushing hard for domestic reforms to facilitate investment, reforming defense procurement, and capitalizing on China plus one diversification, we perhaps got complacent. Now, why we got complacent is another story for another day. But now, with Trump and Putin to meet again, India is reclaiming its mediator aspirations, or so it seems. Because a little scrutiny will tell us nothing decisive can be expected from Alaska. In my opinion, there are some roadblocks that hinder the Alaska summit proceedings. Even with Trump's flair for theatrics and self-assuredness, three big roadblocks remain. First is the land swap paradox. Trump's team has repeatedly mentioned the land swap. The question is how? Ukraine doesn't hold any Russian territory. Russia only partially holds the annexed Ukrainian regions. Now, Putin wants all four annexed territories without more fighting, and Ukraine refuses to gift land it's still defending. Does Trump mean to ask Russia to give its land to Ukraine? Which is a very outlandish proposition. Or does Trump mean to ask Russia to give some of the land it has taken militarily back to Ukraine? Again, outlandish. So the strategy then has a fundamental paradox to resolve. The second is battlefield dynamics per se. The war in Ukraine began in 2014 with Russia's annexation of Crimea and the de facto control over the Donbas region. In 2022, Moscow escalated that war to a full-scale invasion, seeking to seize more territory and formally declaring four Ukrainian regions, which is Donetsk, Lugansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson, as part of Russia. Now, of these, Donetsk and Lugansk were part of the earlier occupied Donbas, while Zaporizhia and Kherson have been the new claims. However, as you can see, from 2014 to 2025, after 11 years of grinding conflict, Russia fully controls only Donetsk. Roughly a quarter each of Lugansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia remains under Ukrainian control, with fierce fighting ongoing. Despite expectations of major breakthroughs, battlefield dynamics have stayed relatively static on both sides. And currently, Russia's summer offensive has underperformed. Notably, following Trump's announcement of planned talks with Putin in Alaska, Russian forces have intensified operations, ramping up pressure on the key town of Prokhorovsk, attempting to seize as many villages as possible before potential negotiations, and yet Russian control averages at about 20% of Ukrainian territory today. Putin's strategy hinges on negotiating from a rather simplified battlefield dynamics, which is not going to hold. And you know why? And that brings us to the third roadblock, which is the diffused power differential. Who holds the cards to end the Ukraine war? Now, Trump may hold immense power, but the US cannot single-handedly end the conflict. It has tried and it has failed. Now, Russia, for all its reputed military might, has also failed to secure victory on the battlefield, while Ukraine, despite its resilience and courage, remains unable to reclaim its lost territories through force alone. That said, in its fourth year, the Ukraine war boasts of the world's most advanced drone warfare capabilities by Ukraine, despite war fatigue and apparent fissures in Zelensky's popularity. And Russia is in an overheated war economy mode, throwing hundreds of thousands of its men into the meat grinder and concentrating resources into weapons production to keep the war going at a huge cost. And then there is Europe. Unable to play a decisive role initially, Europe's unprecedented transformation to ramp its defense spending despite fragile solidarity and resilience to stay united behind Ukraine has been rather surprising. While the UK and France have maintained consistent strategic positions, it is Germany's rearmament and Poland's resurgence that has been pretty pivotal. As Donald Trump took office in January, Poland, then as the EU Council chair, championed security and defense as core priorities, driving a difficult but essential enabler toward military modernization at the EU-wide level for a whole 6 months. Chancellor Merz's constitutional changes have boosted Germany's defense spending, and this has complemented Poland's leadership in steering structural reforms within a traditionally geo-economic bloc. And this together has reshaped Europe's strategic focus towards security preparedness and in the process has accorded it undeniable agency as a bloc. Now today, Europe provides the main support to Ukraine, not the US anymore. Because even if it is the US weapons, it's purchased by Europe for Ukraine. And therefore, today, Europe has much more agency than Putin wishes it to have. So the point is, Europe's and Ukraine's agencies are crucial. There is credible evidence to show that if the Alaska talks are steered bilaterally, that is to say between the United States and Russia, the diffused power differential among key stakeholders that I just told you is going to flop the Alaska outcomes even before they start taking effect. The most optimal next step is to have a real ceasefire before deciding on the questions of territory and guarantees, etc. Owing to past experiences and in the past 6 months alone, it sounds easier said than done. So now let's understand how is it that Donald Trump is trying to get this done. So what is the Trump carrot here? So Trump has promised to give Ukraine some due, and if you remember, it has also signed a minerals deal with Kyiv in April this year. And the same Donald Trump is now dangling some eye-popping offers to Russia. You know what those are? A minerals access to in Russian-occupied Ukraine, lifting sanctions on Russia's aviation sector, of course, which has been crippled because of sanctions, and even letting Russia develop Arctic resources in the Bering Strait, an area holding an estimated 13% of the world's oil. Now, for a man who once almost convinced the world about militarily taking Greenland, this sounds counterintuitive. The US has carefully guarded its Arctic dominance for decades. Handing any of that to Moscow would be a seismic policy shift. That's if Trump means it. And that, you see, is the complexity. And that said, if against all odds, Alaska summit produces even a partial step towards peace, India could quietly position itself yet again for a constructive role in Ukraine's reconstruction, bridging American, European, Russian, and Ukrainian interests. Sounds risk-averse? Yes, it is. Sounds aspirational? Also yes. And my reading is that this is Trump. Anything is possible. From a headline-grabbing deal announced beamingly on Truth Social to an in-effect flop with fighting resuming within hours or days, the most probable scenario would be a step forward, like I said, to the next stage, not a complete resolution per se. Now, just to circle things back to India, my opinion is that India should keep hedging to avoid the fate of being collateral damage in someone else's great power drama. But as Alaska looms, one thing is clear. The real battlefield is as much about leverage, resilience, and perception as it is about territory and brute power. And on that front, the real question before India is to translate its untapped potential into real strategic leverage, the safest strategy to navigate the Trump era. And that, as we know, is no easy feat. So I'll be back to discuss the fate of the Alaska summit and India's budding role yet again in bringing wars to an end. Stay tuned.